So it is a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Meghan Forbes here at the Institute of Art History at the Czech Academy of Sciences. And before introducing her, let me thank my colleagues Martin Madl and Katarina Mašterová for their dedication, and also Victoria Vitu, for their dedication and effort that allowed us to broadcast today's lecture online via Zoom. Also, on behalf of the Photomatrix project team, I would like to invite all of you interested in photography histories and questions regarding photomechanical printing to attend the 3 lectures of this series dedicated to our topic. Specifically, our dear colleague, Dr. Kamila Balbi, will delve into the intriguing persona of Erwin Panofsky and his approach to photography. Then Dr. Anthony Hembrich's talk will address the mid-19th century interest in new printing technologies and the changes in the reprographic industry. And finally, Dr. Kim Timby will speak about the mid-20th century color turn in art reproduction. As I mentioned earlier, it is a truly my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Meghan Forbes. Meghan's interest in Czech history traces back to her master's studies in Czech literature at Columbia University in New York, and she then completed her PhD in Slavic languages and literatures at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Her dissertation, in the middle of it all, Prague, Brno, and the avant-garde networks of interwar Europe, was supervised by Professor Jindřich Toman, author of Photomontage in Print, a book familiar to Czech audiences that it was published by the Kant publishers. Meghan has extensively researched and published on the Czech avant-garde with articles such as Devětsil and Dada, a poetics of play in the interwar Czech avant-garde, published in Art Margins, and To Reach Over the Border in International Conversation Between the Bauhaus and Devětsil in Umění, a journal published by our institute. She has also contributed book chapters on the exchange between the Czech avant-garde and the Bauhaus, transnational network building in avant-garde periodicals, and reflections of the Russian Revolution in Czech avant-garde print. Recently, she has been researching Míra Holzbachová, a Czech dancer, journalist, a Devětsil member, and also a communist enthusiast. Her publications also include texts on Toyen, William Kentridge, Kurt Schwitters, Bohuslav Rejnek, Lajos Kaša, Katarzyna Kobro, Vladislav Střeminsky, and Lucia Moholy. Among her professional experiences, Meghan has been a CMAP Fellow for Central and Eastern Europe at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and a postdoctoral fellow in the Leonard A. Lauder Research Center for Modern Art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. In the Czech Republic, she has recently collaborated with the Institute of Czech Literature and our Institute of the Czech Academy of Sciences and the publishing house Carolinum. She works as a freelance writer, translator, gardener, and curator, including her involvement in the forthcoming Lucia Moholy exhibition in Prague. Now, let me conclude my introduction with a personal note. Before meeting Meghan in person last year, I encountered her presence several times online and through her texts, which resonated with me from the beginning. We finally met thanks to Lucia Moholy and a catalogue for her solo exhibition being prepared for this summer at Kunsthalle Praha, to which we both contributed our texts. Meghan kindly shared with me, at that time a total foreigner, some of the documents she had gathered throughout her research. As you all know from your experiences, these moments and unexpected encounters are crucial for maintaining our passion for art history. And I am delighted that this encounter not only led to a friendship, as we discovered our shared interests not only in photomechanical printing and reproductions, but also gardening and other stuff, but also to Meghan's lecture today, which will explore the topic of her upcoming book, printed and published by Artefactum and Carolinum publishing houses, Technologies for the Revolution, the Czech Avant-Garde in Print. But before Meghan starts her talk, I'd like to invite Katarzyna Doležalová, who is a conservator at our institute, because she prepared some few examples of štočky, those process blocks used for photomechanical printing for us, so that you will have something to see in reality, not just in the PowerPoint presentation. And she will just say a few words about what she prepared.
I arranged with Megan that I can switch to Czech because I wasn't prepared in introducing in English. Takže já bych vám jenom představila hrozně v krátkosti, že na Ústavu dějin umění máme sbírku čtočků, která čítá asi 2000–3000 kusů, přesně nevíme, protože je to úplně teďka novinka, kde se tím začínáme zabývat. A vlastně v těchto dnech začínáme evidenci štočků, které se týkají lokality Jičín. A je to opravdu v této fázi, jak vidíte, je to vlastně kavice, že štočky jsou v různě uložené v různých jako stavu poškození a různě, jak vidíte, prostě ta dřevěná podložka, na tom je jakási buď, možná Megan o tom bude, nebo určitě o tom bude mluvit, že tam je hlinková nebo měděná destička a jenom jsem vzala jako dvě ukázky, kde vlastně to vidíte, že potom se z těch destiček tiskne buď z plochy, anebo z výšky, že tady vidíte jako relief plánu určitého kostela. A ještě mi přišlo hrozně zajímavé, že tady máme i takovou kolekci jako štočků, které byly tištěny z plochy v různých barvách a jsou tady vlastně i nátisky jednotlivých těch barevných variant. Takže tady vlastně červená, žlutá a modrá. Tak to je asi jakoby v krátkosti, co bych tomu řekla, protože se hrozně těším, že se o tom dovím sama víc, jako jakým způsobem to jako se tisklo.
Tak moc děkuju. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you. That was several very generous introductions, and it's really special to have the Štočky here with us, the kind of star of the show. So that's amazing. Thank you. I would also just like to start with a few brief thank yous. Of course, to Hanna Bureos also for that incredibly kind, generous introduction. And with Hanna and Fedora Parkman in the spring or winter of last year, we really started the discussion about this book project, which really encouraged me to kind of finish through with the project I've been working on for a long time. So I'm really grateful for those generative talks we had about a year ago and just a very collegial and truly like a friendship kind of collaboration around this book project. Also in the Photo Matrix team, I want to thank Katarina Mashtarova, Kamila Balbi, Vittoria Vitu for all the really friendly and warm and generous conversations that we've had while I've been here this month or the last 2 months. Of course, to thank Tomasz Winter and Helena Danjova for their work in helping to bring me here and bring this book into the world in a year's time. So stay tuned with Artefactum and Carolinum. And thank you. Also, I just really appreciate that we were able to have these very generative meetings in this time with Hanna, with the book's editors, translator, designers. So it's been really a really productive time while I've been here. And just outside of Prague, I want to thank the Metropolitan Museum of Art, who helped finance some of the production aspects of the book, and the Association of Print Scholars for helping to finance late research in this project. And I'll take Hanna's lead and just say on a personal note that finishing this book in the fall of last year, the first draft, was quite a challenge. Many of you know my zlý pejsek Eliška, and she was dying. And it was really hard for me to kind of understand why I was really like pushing this through and struggling. And truly to see so many people here that I care so deeply about, from friends that I've had for 15 years to new friends to many colleagues who I also consider friends and so forth. It's just, I mean, it gives a point to this work that I'm presenting today that goes beyond the printed words on the page, which of course I care very much about. So thank you all for being here, and I hope that I don't disappoint. So this is a combination of a sneak peek of some of the juiciest bits of this book project and also some of the outtakes. I'll offer a very brief introduction to the book. Devětsil in this room probably needs no introduction. but just how I'm framing it in my book manuscript, which is Technologies for the Revolution, the Czech Avant-Garde in Print. So it's organized across an introduction and 5 chapters to chronologically span the full decade of the 1920s, with a focus on the years 1922 to 1928. And it shows how Devětsil used its publications in order to convey a textual and visual approach to art making and poetry, a revolution in form on the printed page. The book is conceived as an exhibition space of sorts that engages different media that were represented in print. So that's architecture, typography, poetry, picture poems, film poems, the theater. And as a whole, the book makes newly visible, I hope, just how the printed matter of Devětsil required collaboration not only with the group's own artistic milieu, but also with publishers and printers who actually set the type, pressed ink to paper, and bound the final product. The revolution in the book's title is not only meant to suggest the specific utopic leftist social vision of Devětsil's members, but also the impact of advances in new printing technologies and the many revolutions made on those new machines in order to bring the group's publications to a wider audience. It is the engagement of Devětsil with print technologies and print technicians that is the organizing topic of today's talk. And again, the star of tonight's show is the Stoček, whom I know has many admiring fans here. And if you're not familiar with the Stoček or Stočky, they'll get a proper introduction in a moment. So what is a Stoček? In April of 1928, an issue of Devětsil's Keystone magazine, Red, was published that was dedicated to the Osvobozené divadlo, or the Liberated Theater, which was the avant-garde stage section of Devětsil, and which Jindřich Honzel was editor of this special issue. The number features ample photographic documentation of the company's staging, and these are images that would crop up regularly in the period in various books and periodicals. In the family estate of the director Honzel, many original photographs of these well-known images are held, and they include various instructions for publication that are written on the back. And one of these photographs that would also appear in Red, a scene from Nevěsta, credits the photograph on the verso of this particular example to Petri Týden. And we see in Honzel's copy of a corresponding issue of that magazine, Petri Týden, indeed, that he has marked the image with the note, turn into a process block, or much more, an easier verb in Czech, oštočkovat. My new favorite word. And thus, the image can be traced through these multiple cycles of repetition. So either he would have made a photograph from, or have commissioned a photograph of the photograph in Petri Týden to make the Stoček, or they would have received the photograph from Petri Týden and from that made this new Stoček. Okay, but again, what is a Stoček? Well, we've seen some here, and now I'll walk us through. Oh, and here is the full page layout in Petri Týden. Okay, so very generally, it's a block that's type high for letterpress printing with a raised surface on which the ink would come into contact and then be pressed paper to paper and printed. And I don't have time to kind of go through all the processes of letterpress printing here today, but I've chosen some images from Petri Týden and the US Trade Manual Commercial Engraving and Printing from the 1920s to kind of visualize some of these processes. So beyond this rudimentary understanding of what a Stoček is, in the course of writing my book, it became fundamental to understand how they were made. And this likewise informed a significant revision that I propose in the book to our understanding of what encompasses the so-called picture poem, obrazová báseň, which was Devětsil's innovation in the field of photomontage, and notions of mechanical reproducibility that come across regularly in the group's theoretical writings, especially by its leading figure, Karel Tajge in particular. I argue that in a practical, technical understanding of these processes related to print production in the 1920s is central to a reevaluation of the seminal texts and artistic outputs of Devětsil in particular, but also the European and Soviet avant-gardes in general. A lot of people were making sztuczki, not just here. It also brings to the fore a consideration of the avant-garde artist and the print practitioner, something that is somehow more or less elided in most discussions of avant-garde printed matter. And all of this I work through in detail in the book, but in the framework of a talk format, I've opted to limit my comments to first outlining the technical side of the sztuczek's production, considering the relationship of those who made them and printed them with members of the avant-garde, and offering a visual mapping of the migration of certain images across various print exemplars, like we saw one example already from Red, Pestriti Den, Honzel's estate in Osvobozene divadlo. So this highlights the more material approach of the book rather than delving into its theoretical aspects in relation to picture poem, film poem, typomontage, which are all there, and I hope you'll engage with in printed form. So the sztuczek is referred to often as a cliché in French, and the same name also has been adapted into English, German, also used in Czech. The term is used to describe actually different phases in the history of block printing and the production of a photographic image, and there is no standard and regularly used term in English. In the Encyclopedia of Printing, Photographic, and Photomechanical Processes, the cliché is defined thus: French term at one time anglicized and applied to electrotypes, stereotypes, and process blocks. It was also used to indicate negatives and positives plates. And also, block processes include all those processes in which the aid of photography, a relief surface is produced, capable of being printed from an ordinary printing press rather than a letterpress. So some of these processes predate the history of photography, such as blocks worked by the human hand and a set of engraving tools into wood or linoleum. That's, for example, how Josef Čapek produced his many book cover designs, or in this image of an early work by Tajge for the publication Variacon. With the advent of photography through photomechanical processes, an image is inscribed then onto the metal plate. It is this latter category, that is, blocks prepared for printing via these new photomechanical processes, that are of special interest in talking about how images were shared across these interwar avant-gardes. And so I have opted to use the term process block more broadly for the term cliché or the specific Czech term sztuczek in order to capture this specific intermediary role of the three-dimensional object, the creation of which is the necessary step that comes after the production of an original art image and before its letterpress printing. The photomechanical nature of producing process blocks in this period is also essential for understanding the theoretical writings of Devětsil, again, as it related to a discourse of reproducibility. And it's, again, great that we have these examples here, so you can really, these are all through photomechanical processes that this set of sztuczki were created. In the Czech context, the cliché has been defined in the Hookerův technický slovník naučný, or Hooker's instructional technical dictionary, as, quote, a printer's form from a single unit, as distinct from typesetting, which is composed from multiple letter forms. It has been made from wood, lead, zinc, copper, celluloid, etc. The image is affixed to the process block, sztuczek, etched into the zinc, and nailed onto an oak block. It can be derived from a line drawing or a half-tone autotype. In correspondence by members of Devětsil, we see the word sztuczek or cliché appear frequently with regards to what images to print and how to acquire them. This is also the case in their foreign correspondence, as the process blocks are exchanged back and forth across international avant-garde networks. The fact that printers across Europe would be working with the same standards of measurements, so in contrast to the United States that is a different set of measurements, this meant that not only the vocabulary, but the objects themselves used for reproduction were interchangeable, as the necessary height of the blocks for letterpress printing would be the same. So they could send a sztuczek from Prague to Berlin, and they would be able to print it just the same on their letterpress machines. The various stages in the reproduction of images through the photomechanical process and the distinction between producing those images from a halftone versus line-drawn source is nicely visualized through a set of drawings, photographs, and process blocks of architectural plans by Vít Oberthal, which are held here at the National Technical Museum. And 2 process blocks of his functional villa, which we see here from north and south views, are rendered both as line drawings. And we also have an example of a line drawing here up on the table up front. In another example, a 3-dimensional model for a different villa has been photographed, and the negative of this photograph would then have been used for inscribing the image via the halftone process to a metal plate and finally affixed to that type-high wood ready for letterpress printing. And we have several examples of this here as well on the table. The result of creating these process blocks, that is, their printing in a serial form, can be found in the fall 1933 issue of Kvart, an architectural magazine under Oberthal's editorship. Although Kvart is somewhat outside the purview of my book and in some ways was intended as a counter-narrative to Taige's notions of architecture and typography, the holdings in Oberthal's archive offers a unique opportunity to illustrate some of the vocabulary and processes integral to Devětsil publishing practices and is a helpful illustration for the photomechanical processes being summarized here. The existing process blocks and their printed publication allows us to visualize the path from drafting to printing that is central to how Devětsil publications are considered in Technologies for the Revolution, which takes into account the private behind-the-scenes work as well as these published outcomes. Understanding the process block, what it is and how it was made, is essential to both its interpretation as the Czech Avant-Garde's theorization of photography and the concept of poetism and the picture poem, and also key to understanding what Taige had in mind when he describes modern typography as reflecting new modes of technology. Its production, use, and distribution exemplify how Devětsil used its books and magazines to print and share images across a wider avant-garde nexus. It is a physical trace of the networks that Devětsil built. And who made the shtočky, who made the process blocks? This guy, for example. And I know he has a lot of fans in this room. At the back of Život 2, one of the 2 Devětsil anthologies, along with Revoluční sborník that were published in 1922 and really kicked off their own publishing endeavors, we see a photo from the offices of Neubert and Sons, which pictures, quote, the largest photographic reproduction device in the whole of Czechoslovakia. The impressive photo apparatus of Neubert and Sons is not captured on its own, but rather photographed with a man in a technician's coat, posed facing forward and in front of the device, underscoring the necessary collaboration between human and machine, and also, as Hanna Bude suggested to me, cleverly indicating the large scale of the photomechanical instrument. The same image was also included in several advertisements for Neubert and Sons and other print periodicals, including this example from Rozpravy Aventina in 1930, in which it is one of 6 photographs that show off the firm's impressive facilities, and it pictures workers at these machines. In the case of Devětsil, good collaboration with the shtočky maker, the printer, and so forth was essential. These earliest anthologies, Revoluční sborník and Život 2, are a dynamic and physical embodiment of the group's technologized and utilitarian approach to art in a post-war world that calls for revolution not via a violent or nationalist stance, but rather by embodying a new beauty as advertised on the cover of Život 2. Again, this is quite, I know these are very well-known material and have been really well discussed by many others before me. An embrace of all that is modern and industrial without losing the individual's humanity to the machine. This would continue for a full decade or so of the group's output. With the Neubert and Sons advertisement, we see that Devětsil had at its disposal highly competent professionals to manifest its unconventional vision. And just for fun, some family photos of the Neuberts with turkeys. And notably, none of these people are the ones standing in front of the photo apparatus, the shtočky technician. And more relevant to this topic, to this talk, are views of various departments of their firm. So not just related in these images to process block production and letterpress printing, but we also see lithography and engraving. And it's significant that these were all published in Pestrý týden in a special issue commemorating 50 years of Neubert and Son. And of course, Pestrý týden was a basically a magazine of pictures. So they're really acknowledging the importance of Neubert and Son to make possible the work that they were publishing at Pestry Tiden. But the example from Život of the technician at his machine is in fact a rare instance in a Devětsil publication in which a laborer involved in the production of the group's printed matter is figured. And even here he remains unnamed, as in the photos ostensibly celebrating workers in Pestry Tiden. While Devětsil writings regularly championed an imagined proletariat and working class, in reality, its members, largely from an intellectual elite bourgeois background, had a more active dialogue with a broadly pan-European set of avant-garde colleagues than with the workers for whom they like to speak on behalf. The most notable exception to this is precisely the necessary engagement with the printers who produce their works. Though access to such correspondence is scarce due to lack of archival materials related to the printing firms, and less so as well to the publishing houses, or these papers are in a somewhat state of a disorganization, which is also some evidence as to how the archives have privileged the voice of the artist over the practitioner, there are hints to what these negotiations looked like in remaining letters and firsthand accounts, which I will elaborate to some extent here. So a notable example is the production of Jaroslav Seifert's 1925 poetry volume, Na Vlnách TSF. There are no reproductions of photographs or image-based works of art in this volume, but it did have an experimental typographic layout, again, quite well known, designed by Tajge, for which the book is appreciated today. This led to some difficult conversations with those tasked with actually printing the book. Seifert more or less acknowledged as much in his memoirs when he described the process of working with the printer František Obzina. And you can see here, and I'll read what Seifert recounted in his memoirs some decades later. The serious printing house of Mr. Obzina in Vyškov had to basically use all the type in their cases in order to set the text. And on top of that, they had to throw out the window all the classical rules of typography, which had been perfected since the time of Gutenberg and matured into modern standards of book design. The titles and text of the poems were in all different kinds of typefaces. Every poem was composed differently. Some ran horizontal, others vertical across the page. The old man in Vyškov shook his head over the whole business, but still he complied. Today's youth would characterize Tajge's endeavors as a typographic rodeo. And this has also been published in Karel Srb's book of Tajge and Typographia. So this rather chaotic rodeo resulted in some criticism of the book for not living up to the Devětsil principles of rationalism and utility, but Seifert nevertheless described the poetry volume's intention, quote, to announce the spirit of poetism on its page, not only loudly, but with a provocative style, end quote. And provocative it was indeed. An untitled review in the periodical Vitrinka, possibly by its editor Arthur Novak, critiqued Na Vlnách TSF for turning all of those purported ideals, quote, on their head. Here, the constructive, ornamental, or decorative are all replaced with mindless clownery, end quote. The review picks up on the contradictions inherent to poetism and the Devětsil project generally. And this lambasting illustrates in detail just how challenging it would have been for professional printers charged with executing this book. And I'll quote a portion of what's up here. I wish he, as in Tajge, could have seen the production of the book of which he provided a draft. He would have seen in the Obzina printing house a circus, the kind of which very few exist in the world. The compositor ran around the whole composing room from typecase to typecase in order to accommodate the mock-up's instructions. And they have a lot of typecases at Obzina. Indeed, only a few printing houses in the whole Republic would have typeset that book due to the quantity of sorts of scripts. So this review not only makes visible, using the very language of the circus, which was so popular with Devětsil, the role of the professional technicians working in the printing house, but suggests that Tajge did not see them. As such, it indicates a breakdown in the sort of professional and collegial collaboration that Devětsil seemingly aimed to maintain with the professional class of workers, which they seem to have believed they accomplished. The group's books and periodicals might have only actually found a readership amongst an envisioned proletariat in these workers that were involved in printing them. And if that is the case, the suggestion in this review that these avant-garde objects actually made the lives of print professionals exceedingly difficult and were certainly not platforms for their collective liberation is all the more damning. In some cases, the relationship between publisher and printer was overtly antagonistic. A rather snarky editorial note appears on the cover of Literární noviny from January 1928, and this isn't in any way directly related to Devětsil, just a kind of fun aside. They produced this impressive exemplar from Mexico. Presumably, this would have been printed from a process block, not typeset in Spanish, with the editorial note, quote, "We present our readers an interesting example of typesetting from a Mexican magazine of the professional organization Crom. It's hard to say if such meticulous typesetting could be distinguished as beautiful. Definitely hard work and goodwill is here, more on display than true taste. Nevertheless, it wouldn't hurt our typographers if they might glean something from our Mexican colleagues, that is, if they might dedicate a bit more love and precision to their work." Somehow suggesting that those engaged in the realm of printmaking and typography, mind you, perhaps by this very person who typeset and printed this note at home in Czechoslovakia, are inadequate at the work they're doing. So, on the other hand, when in early 1926, an editorial statement at the Devětsil magazine Pasmo, based in Brno, written by Artuš Černík, appears to throw the process block technician under the bus, who we might envision as that man standing at the photomechanical apparatus in Život 2, Tajge was not having it. In a letter to Černík, Tajge berates him for this sentence that was published in a notice to readers in Pasmo, shown here. And Černík writes, "By mistake and not by any fault of the editorial staff, the size of this issue's process blocks were produced too small." And that statement was meant to explain why certain images did not appear in the issue that had been dedicated also to Osvobozene divadlo. And this and a few other mishaps leads Černík to promise in the note that there will be another issue dedicated to theater, which the present one was supposed to have been. But what especially peeves Tajge in this note is the use of the phrase, "not by any fault of the editorial staff," which to his mind makes the whole operation around Pasmo, at which he was an editor, and perhaps unsurprisingly a few minutes later was not, seem unprofessional. And he wrote in this letter, Tajge to Černík, "It was the manufacturer of the process blocks who screwed up. So fine, they can't go into this number," he writes in the letter, but then he retorts that this does not remove their editorial responsibility for the issue. So he seems to suggest an understanding here for a shared responsibility and outcome of Devětsil's printed matter with the print technicians. And in Red, some years later, in 1929, an article, which was under Karel Tajge's editorship, an article in an issue dedicated to typography by Oldřich Poskočil, who was an editor at the trade magazine Typografia, would indeed address the need for collaboration between artist and printer. And Poskočil writes, "Constructivist typography does not always necessarily result in the simplification of the specialized work of typesetting. The economization and rationalization of the work would demand a close contact between the graphic designer and the practitioner executing it." So while Typografia was for the most part intended precisely for those people doing the work of typesetting, printing, binding, and so forth, alongside articles on the newest version of a linotype machine or technical descriptions of how to produce process blocks, it also evidences the ways in which the vision of the avant-garde was taken up by professional printers as it prints exemplars from Devětsil books and magazines, as well as an international milieu of new typographers. And I talk about this in some detail in the book, and I'll come around to one example here in a moment. But in short, through the operator, compositor, typesetter, page feeder, printer, and so forth, they receive little mention and are almost never named by Devětsil. They were essential comrades, nevertheless, in their experimental endeavors. And on the pages of Typografia, in an article describing the new Czech models for the linotype machine, a photograph of an empty chair intended for the typesetter is a poignant illustration of the simultaneously essential and anonymous work of this practitioner. So What did Devětsil do with the štočky? So we opened with Hansel's note about oštočkovat and saw ample examples abound that show Devětsil members looking at magazines precisely as sources for future image circulation in their own periodicals. And Tajga's personal collection of magazines held in his papers at the Památník národního písemnictví, or the Museum of Czech Literature, represents an impressive library of the major avant-garde and modernist periodicals produced across Europe in the 1920s. Together, they show clearly how he kept a keen eye on various international publications for inspiration in terms of design, but also with regards to sourcing images for his own books and periodicals. From these, he then sourced images to reappear in Devětsil books and magazines, and this is a feature that I highlight throughout Technologies for the Revolution. But one particularly illustrative example of how Tajga was reading these publications is his copy of the German Dadaist Kurt Schwitter's magazine März, which was published from 1923 to 1932. From the first page of the very first issue, we see that Tajga has cut one of Schwitter's März-build collages, which in fact evidences a mutual exchange in interest, as the collage itself includes scraps from the artist Schwitter's previous trip to Prague in 1921. It includes a word fragment of the city name in Czech, that's the word Praha cut off mid-H, and the word redakce, or editorial, sourced from a magazine. Later in the same issue, Tajga has made a notation across the top of a Francis Picabia drawing, presumably interested in featuring it in one of his own publications, as he records its dimensions and makes a note that it could be reproduced as a line-drawn process block from which to reprint it. Indeed, both the Schwitter's collage and the Picabia drawing are later published in Tajga's 1930 monograph O humoru, clownech a dadaistech svět, který voní, on humor, clowns, and Dadaist, the world which smells good. Thanks to photography, printed images were a source for ever further reproduction, but also process blocks were a material mode by which the avant-gardes across Europe could efficiently and economically exchange letterpress print-ready images. So not just asking for an exchange of photographs, but actually asking for an exchange of the štočky themselves. It was something that Schwitters himself actively solicited for in März. Pasted on the inside of the cover to Tajga's issue of a copy of issue 6 from October 1923 is a small notice that reads, "Do you want to send in your manuscripts, process blocks, woodcuts? Non-contractually, no honorarium will be paid, no guarantee for acceptance." So in other words, should one choose to send in something for publication in März, they're welcome to do so, but Schwitters may or may not publish it and would offer no compensation for author or artist or anything like that. But perhaps more enticing was this offer made of exchange, which we can see posted here on the front cover of Tajga's copy. Similarly, in 1922, the Buch Neuer Künstler, or the Book of New Artists, published in separate German and Hungarian editions by the Julius Fischer Verlag in Vienna and edited by Laszlo Moholy-Nagy and Lajos Kossak, visually illustrates the rich result of a strategy of sharing. A 2-page long list credits the source of the book's process blocks and indicates just how extensive these networks reached. And apologies for the quality of these images, but hopefully you can make out to some extent that they're borrowing these process blocks or štočky from the French L'Esprit Nouveau to Dutch De Stijl, German Der Sturm, and the predominantly Russian language periodical produced in Berlin, Objekt, Gegenstand, as well as Ma's own archives. And so the idea is these were expensive to produce, and so when they could, they shared them. And sometimes they didn't make process blocks or štočky at all, but use the available materials of the printing press to reproduce images from elsewhere. So in the Buch Neuer Künstler, the loan of a process block for the printing of a work by Kazimir Malevich is ascribed to Objekt, though in looking through Objekt, I didn't see this image printed there in its short-lived run. But a slightly different version, these are just some examples from Buch Neuer Künstler. A slightly different version of the work, as we can see here, was already published in 1920 in the volume Suprematism, 34 Drawings. And this publication was an adaptation of Malevich's suprematist paintings, but here printed as new lithographs, which he called drawings. In the introduction to the book, published by Unovis in Vitebsk in 1920, Malevich opens, quote, Friends have taken on the task of publishing a book of my suprematist works, but despite their wish to produce it as well and comprehensively as possible, it has only proved feasible to carry out a small part of what had been intended. It has appeared in black and gray. It includes a small number of constructions, and the means available have not allowed them to be produced as they actually are. As they actually are, that is, as paintings. So Malejevich's famous black square and black circle are understood to be groundbreaking in the history of art and advancing a notion of non-objective painting, but they also indicate creative innovations in print reproductions of artworks. So here they appear as simple geometric shapes in black ink on white background and lend themselves well to be reproduced without the need for photography, but rather by making use of various print technologies such as lithography in the example of 34 drawings. Thus, process blocks derived from a photograph of an artist's painting was not needed at all, but rather the work is rendered in its idea and also could be created from items found readily in the typecase. This we can see as an example here in Vish, Objekt, Gegenstand, was a convention that took up the use of letterpress printing, and it's something that also appeared in Czech print. So cute. So they would have used either wood or metal to ink these, notions of the black square, black circle. And as we see here in the 1926 volume SSSR, Uvahy, Kritiky, Poznámky, USSR Reflections, Reviews, Notes, and very similar to the mode in which they had appeared in Objekt. So this would have removed the cost of making the process blocks altogether, but have required an engagement, again, with the typesetter and printer to sort of reimagine Malevich on the printed page between a couple of paragraphs. And just as an aside, the disc, which here is rendered as Malejevich's black circle, was of course something of a branding for Devětsil, recurring over and again across its publications. And this is just a few examples of that phenomenon. A similar principle, that is using these available materials from the typecase, is applied in Typographia in a special issue dedicated to various examples and essays related to new typography that had first been published in the German magazine Offset in 1926. There's a translation there of an essay by Laszlo Moholy-Nagy titled Zeitgemäße Typographie. In Czech, it's published as Časová typografia, or contemporary typography in English. The text discusses typography in the context of new technological innovations and what a move away from handset type to machine typesetting has enabled. Quote, this is Moholy-Nagy. The utilization of machinic possibilities is characteristic and decisive to the evolution of technique in our current work. Our contemporary print products correspond significantly with the newest machines, which means they must be based on clarity, succinctness, and precision. The editors of Typographia have likewise illustrated Moholy-Nagy's points with posters, flyers, and other promotional materials from the Bauhaus designed by Bayer, Moholy-Nagy, and others. Nearly all the examples include variously weighted lines and discs, circles, and arrows, so intrinsically associated now with new typography principles. But particularly interesting is this illustration of schematic elements in Czech titled Some Usable Typographic Symbols, that is not attributed in Typographia to any specific typographer, but is presumably the work of the printer or editor of the issue itself, as in fact, it's an adaptation from where we saw it first appear in Moholy-Nagy's text in Offset. In Typographia, where the image is in Offset, it's actually offset printed, but in Typographia on the left, it's letterpress printed. Rather than using a process block, so taking a photograph of its lithograph and then making a stoček and then printing it again, instead, the compositor has utilized the available materials in the typecase in order to recreate the geometric figures from the original, in some cases utilizing distinct units of metal or wood type to build up what is a single continuous shape in the original work. So by that, I mean, we can see kind of these little very slender white lines, like at the top geometric form in the Czech version, where we can see they've put together probably metal pieces of type, whereas if you see in the offset version, it's a continuous black shape. And this sort of composing, so bringing together different found materials from the typecase and to create this kind of an image, is a sort of precursor or even a parallel to the idea of typomontage, which Zlodiež dovážičaj a kávu is a notable instance. So this is a book of poems by Bibel. Taiga has provided the typographic design, and this gets quite a bit of attention in the last chapter of my book, but for today, that's all it gets. Okay, so back to Stočky and this notion of economy of sharing as a conclusion. So in the same year that Typographia would allow for what amounts to this sort of new typography takeover on its pages, Taiga also published Stavba a basen, which at this point had become a small encyclopedia of Devětsil's visual vocabulary up to that point. And it includes reproductions of works by the architects Le Corbusier, Walter Gropius, Mies van der Rohe, and Tatlin, as well as artists such as Pablo Picasso, Alexander Archipenko, Naum Gabo, Kazimir Malevich, Elizitsky, Piet Mondrian, Theo van Doisburg, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, and Gert Kaden. And from within the Czech milieu, Jiří Voskovec, Jindřich Štyrský, Josef Šíma, Toyen, Jaroslav Rusler, are represented, as are stagings from the Osvobozené divadlo. And Taiga complains that he wished there could have been more images, but I think as it is, it's still quite a nice spread of images. And this is just a sampling. Several of these works appear in multiple Devětsil editions around this time, an indicator of economy. So taking into account the effort and expense of making the process blocks and also the wide range of contemporary artistic production with which Devětsil had engaged and then subsequently exposed to its own audiences. An extensive mapping that traces these images can show us how this visual imagery not only migrated across the Czech printing landscape, but also in the broader pan-European sphere. Just looking at a side-by-side comparison of images in Stavba a basen with those that previously appeared in the Brno-based Pasmo begins to give an indication of this strategy of reuse. So in another letter from Taiga to Černík, this is just, he was always bossing him around, berating him, bossing him, et cetera, et cetera. So poor Černík. So anyway, so in this letter from Taiga to Černík, in preparation for publishing Stavba a basen, Taiga requests the return of specific set of process blocks that had been used in magazines produced in Brno. And he writes, I'm sending a list of process blocks, which I need urgently, from Pasmo and Disc, as in Disc 2, the second volume, for my book, the first pages of which are already at the printers. The list extends to 2 handwritten pages, a small selection of which I'm showing here, where we see the images he's talking about here, actually, where they were in Pasmo and then how they show up in Stavba a basen. And differences in sizes in some cases suggest that maybe he didn't always get the Stočky back, or he did, but they didn't fit the page layout. So maybe in some cases, new Stočky were also produced at any rate. So this list is evident of how conscientiously Devětsil built an archive of images through an investment in producing process blocks that could then be reused across multiple publications. And as such, it again points to the value of that the group placed precisely on the possibility of reproduction for propagating a specific vision of new art in interwar Europe. So I will stop there, and I look forward to your questions, conversation. Please feel free to bring comments or questions in Czech. Thank you.
Thank you, Meghan, so much. It was fascinating. And thanks so much for bringing this issue of like the material aspects of avant-garde interchange and the transnationality of this whole thing, because as we have seen, it's something that is worth studying. And there are so many people. Thank you so much for coming. And I'll just open the discussion. Please ask, comment, tell your whatever you want. Please, Julia.
Thank you for this really amazing talk. I have many questions, but I'll start with a very simple one.
Oh, good.
Which is what about cost? I don't know, were the different prices for the Stotsky or how did they exchange them?
Are you talking specifically about the cost of making the Stotsky or of mailing them?
Both things. Yeah.
Because I would love to know how much it costs to mail. At first, I thought they can't. When I first started seeing this word appear, and I was wondering what the heck is this thing, the Stotsky or cliché, or whatever. And I thought, but they can't possibly be mailing like something this big across borders. It sounded really expensive, but I think it was actually less expensive than the alternative of producing them at home. And actually, in some cases, for example, I didn't mention it here, but Hannes Meyer deconstructs a sort of liberated theater photo montage and says, I want this part of the montage and this, like knowing that they were from different pictures, of course, and saying, please don't send me the cliché, send me the photo. So maybe because of postal costs or whatever, but it's not so clearly like indicated most of the time, that aspect. But in terms of the production of them, and that's why I'm really interested to look further in archives of printers, which again are typically harder to access, to kind of get the nitty-gritty of that. But I do have one example, which I thought about showing today from Melantrich, where like from Neubert and Sons, they've received the mock-ups of like a print from the Stoczek, and then a list of how much it costs. I don't remember off the top of my head, but it was like a significant, it seemed to me, it's hard for me to like break down, from like 100 years ago, but it seemed to me pricey. And you could see like cost saving efforts on the part of Melantrich when you look at the final cover of this particular exemplar that I saw, where some of the cover is uninked completely. So rather than adding a third color or something and have that requiring a third Stoczek, they've just like left it text in white to clearly to like economize on the cost of having these produced. And then also like within Devětsil, they never are saying exactly how much they cost, but they're always saying, let's avoid making Stoczky. or they'll say like even about the photographing, they'll try to avoid commissioning that, say to Neubert and Sons, but so-and-so's brother's coming to town and I think he'll do it for us for free. So it was definitely like a top of mind, the cost. Yeah, thank you.
When the journals like send it from each other, let's say you send it to Gegenstand from Devětsil to Stoczek, like were they compensated? Because I wonder, like, why would they send something so costly to another journal? I mean, is this like, how did it work economically? Like, is there something comparable to the kind of Marxist notion of the money exchange with the image exchange? Like, I don't know.
I think so. I can't answer that definitively, but from my understanding, I think the Merz example with Schwitter's. So that's specifically like the copy of Merz that I showed. It's from Taige's archive. So I think for specific people, Schwitter's, because that wasn't, if you look at that same magazine in an archive somewhere, doesn't have that pasted on Austausch proposal. So I think that that was one thing. It was a notion of exchange, both of periodicals and of printed matter, photographs or Stoczki to create printed matter. But I also think from the part of Devětsil, they saw it as active propagation of their works abroad. So it was there was like an incentive to have work print. So like when Hannes Meyer asks to send things, and then they show up in Das Werk alongside Osvobozene divadlo shows up alongside productions by Meyerhold of the Soviet stage. I think that was in and of itself a very compelling reason to send images or Stoczki. But in particular, within the Czech Avant-Garde, then there was always this like back and forth between like an anxiety of sharing, right? So if you give Czernik your Stoczki and then he doesn't give them back to you in a timely manner, it's holds up this other line in the production plan.
So it was like a gift. It wasn't.
The expectation was you would receive it back. Typically, the expectation you would receive it back. But yeah, I don't think anyone was getting compensated. No. and then a lot of times they don't get sent. So like, for example, it was, I think, photographs, not sztuczki, but from Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, and then Lucia Moholy writes, I think also to Czerny, poor guy, asking, hey, you know, Moholy's photographs, we never got them back, which, you know, may very well may have been her photographs. But yeah, so there's this also evidence of not, you know, giving something out and not receiving it in return, but that was the general understanding.
So, yeah, thank you very much for the fascinating lecture. I'm already familiar with your work. Always you show some new material, so I really enjoyed it. And so, of course, I think, well, I totally agree with the new perspective you bring on Devětsil, because I also think that transnational exchange, or the vehicle of transnational artistic exchange, was this not only the image, but the material element or object of the sztuczek. So this is really interesting. And so in connection with this, I'm wondering if in your research, you encountered these wooden process blocks, but also the films, like sztuczek in the form of films or in some other material form. So this would be my first question. And the other one, I was wondering, since you're a specialist of Devětsil, and also there are many other specialists of Devětsil, I think, here in this room, if this engagement with photomechanical reproduction also translates in other artistic media or artistic production that Devětsil was creating, like painting, if there is something of this interest in photomechanical suggested in some other way.
Do you mean outside of print?
Yeah.
It's like outside of print. Yeah, I don't have a very good answer to that last question, but I guess I could answer it from the other way around, which is, for example, when we do have, and I didn't get into this in the talk, so maybe this won't be so comprehensible, but the notion of the picture poem that I argue really is for Taige, the point is that it went through this photomechanical process of making sztuczek of the original work. But when we have those original works, which we do have in a few cases like Pozdravsky and so forth, which again, I know there are many people here who are very familiar and have written about these materials, but I don't see that work itself as a picture poem, because it's actually, like he said, it should be thrown out, but then the language kind of falls apart when we try to explain this work, when we see it reproduced in color, for example, today, because the original exists, but I don't even see that as a picture poem, and I wouldn't reproduce that work, for example, in my book. But so maybe that's a bit of an example, because in making that original work, they are thinking about the photomechanic process. Maybe they're even seeing this color image in black and white already, because the whole point is for it to reappear as letterpress printed down the line. And as Taige, of course, said, throw away the original. And unfortunately for him, I guess some of them still exist. And I don't remember what your first question.
Just about the material object, if it was wood, but also film. Or
oh, yeah.
Form.
So that's a kind of a frustrating, that's like the rabbit hole I've been going down for 10 years of looking for. So this was such a boon to have these sztuczki here today. And Eva Knoblok is here in the Umělecko-průmyslové Museum archive and so forth. I've seen sztuczki also in Národní Galerie, but I haven't seen any from Devětsil. Like, I mean, I showed this one of Taige that's at Národní Galerie, and it's a lino cut that he made in the, 1917, and then it was produced in Varicon in 1924. But like, for example, if anyone knows where like Pozdrav ze cesty exists like this, I would love to know.
From the letters, sometimes I get the impression that it may have been a photograph, like a cliché, or sztuczek may have been like paper or film or something lighter than the wood itself.
That's my original, was my original thinking too. And so one possibility is like, for example, when they mailed them abroad, there was really no reason to mail this piece of wood. So they were probably just mailing like the metal part, for example. but I don't know, because I've also never seen, well, I guess I have in a few cases, but typically you don't see the metal part like divorced from the type wood block, but that would have been a more economic way, for example, to share them for sure. Yeah. I can show you later from Melantric, those are paper that was sent as like, but those are proofs basically. Those is something different. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe the last question, and then we can continue with a more relaxed way.
So thanks so much. It was quite a great show. You touched upon really important topics like artistic labor, discrimination, and migration. But in this part, I'm still like wondering, because thanks to the work of like Czech and others, we know the dummies, Karel Tiger, for example, also letterpress, and others. So have you made the comparison between these like the original drawings by Tiger and the final like letterpress output, for example, in case of the Beetle? So have you really made this comparison? And could you really like tell us like which kind of like whether like the people in printing house were really like collaborating on that? We know that avant-garde designers have been complaining all the time, so we don't know that collaboration. But could you really like give an example where this collaboration was really productive? That someone like a printing house was really like doing something that was sort of like a reaching out, like other possibilities that the people who supposed to make the design didn't even understand that there are possibilities.
Thank you for that question, because it allows me to just briefly at the end here talk about Kryl a Scotti, which was the printing firm who produced Zloděje z Dovažiče a Kávu and these more bibliophilic editions that came out in the second part of the 1920s. And I mean, I haven't seen personally, but in sort of Taiga a Typografia, we have those the mock-ups for Zloděje z Dovažiče a Kávu, and it's very illustrative because he's very clearly writing there in his notes, this is from a parentheses, or this is from an asterisk, or what, you know, he's really clearly thinking through the materials that are in the typeface when he's constructing that. So that was very much a conversation then with Kryl a Scotti, who took very seriously that, specifically producing that kind of work. And so I think that's a really productive, and that's sort of like the kind of conclusion at the end of my book, is that this typomontage and the work of Zloděje z Dovažiče a Kávu, or Zlom, is really kind of an apex, sort of like a post-picture moment where then you really see this engagement between Taiga and Kryl a Scotti. That said, there's no correspondence that I know of in that regard. It would be really nice to understand what kind of a relationship they had with each other, or if they were also just kind of like huffing and puffing. But I don't think so, because it seems like from all the scholarship I have read on Kryl a Scotti, I mean, it really seemed that was like a fundamental part of their mission. Thank you.